harsh working conditions, and an overwhelming thirst for freedom. A look at how slaves lived in the United States in the 19th century. Greetings. Today we're going to travel back in time and learn about the lives of black slaves in North America. Is it true that even President Thomas Jefferson's staff included an African American woman with children? What the slave hunters were doing and why they were so feared by African Americans? And what was the total value of all the slaves who lived in the US before slavery was abolished? It will extremely surprise you. Be sure to watch the video to the very end to learn all the details of the lives of black people in the century before last. How slavery came to be in the United States. Probably many of you have a question about the appearance of slaves on the territory of America. It is important to note that African Americans were brought to the States back in the 17th century, 1619. Surprisingly, they were pirates who transported slaves from Africa to South America. However, apparently due to the fact that the ship went off the route, the pirates were not in the best position. The Americans, in turn, took special notice of the live valuable cargo. To get out of the unfortunate situation and get back on the right route, the pirates had to make a deal. So black slaves at a very symbolic price fell into the hands of the Americans, and the pirates received a reward in return. And ever since then, slavery seems to have taken root in North America. And all because, firstly, they acted as a cheap labor force, which was so necessary for the development and maintenance of the country's economy. Secondly, before the abolition of slavery in the 60s of the century before last, a huge number of black people were already born in the United States. Henceforth, slaves began to labor on plantations and perform a number of other types of agricultural work, main occupations. Let's analyze what the usual African American was doing for several decades. After that, let's move on to the prohibitions that were adopted at the official level and did not represent anything good for slaves. So, each slave did his job for 12 hours a day. Mostly such work was related to the cultivation and care of cotton, corn, and sugarcane, which were then exported to other countries. In addition to working with cultivated plants, the master of a particular slave kept domestic animals on his farm. For example, pigs. Regularly, black people faced the situation when it was necessary to keep track of both corn and pigs. After all, it was no secret that these domestic animals were very fond of grains. But if a slave dared to whip a pig, the same fate awaited him. The master didn't like it when they raised their hands on pets. Did you know that after slavery in the US, there was an expression that describes hard work without sleep and rest? But no matter how hard such work seemed, slave masters were sympathetic to African Americans. Also, white masters often became the fathers of a good half of black men. Americans did not see this as a vice. After all, it was slaves who kept the economy of the American continent at the proper level. Interesting fact. The third US President Thomas Jefferson kept an African American woman with children born to him. By the way, it was this ruler and national hero who in 1807 issued a law prohibiting the slave trade on the territory of America. Basic prohibitions. As you understand, everywhere there are certain prohibitions, in case of violation of which the guilty party faces punishment. Naturally, slavery in the United States did not bypass this phenomenon. Since slaves began to settle in North America, the following prohibitions have been issued. The first prohibition refers to the main activity of African Americans. The latter were under no circumstances allowed to leave the plantation of their master. The next prohibition, adopted in 1832, limited the literacy of slaves. At that time, it was forbidden to teach blacks to read. Americans were well aware that literacy was bound to lead to rebellion and subsequent uprisings. It makes sense that otherwise a slave could read the Bible, which was especially valued at the time, and then realize the many aspects of a difficult life. Finally, in 1850, the infamous law came out. It authorized the search for slaves who had left the plantations and fled, and it was allowed to search for fugitive African Americans in all states. By the way, even in places where slavery was not recognized. That is why there were special groups of Americans who called themselves slave hunters. They became not only professionals, but also ordinary gentlemen interested in a new job. After these men found runaway slaves, they beat the latter with particular cruelty. No wonder African Americans feared the slave hunters, confrontation between the North and the South. Many of you know or have heard about the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. We draw your attention to the fact that the reason for the confrontation of one side of the Americans with the other was just the unresolved issue of slavery. So, about everything in order. By the early 1860s, the North of America once and for all abandoned slavery, because it was inexpedient to keep African Americans on this territory. The harsh climate did not allow for the proper cultivation of crops and plantations. Finally, capitalism flourished in the northern part of the United States. Plants, factories, and other industrial enterprises were built. But such labor required skilled workers. At the same time, Northerners realized that the South lagged far behind in this regard. For there, the slave system still persisted, which was the main brake on the development of the economy of the whole of America. That is why the North and the South, which did not find a compromise with each other, entered into a fierce battle. The Civil War in the USA lasted for 5 years. In total, there were over 1 million dead and wounded on both sides. Nevertheless, it was after the end of the war that the 16th President of America, Abraham Lincoln, put an end to slavery on this continent on June 19, 1861. You may ask, how did the slaves feel during the war? Of course, many realized the victory and that they would certainly be freed from such oppression. But say, in France, slavery ended after the Great Revolution. In the Russian Empire, slavery in the form of serfdom was abolished by Alexander II in 1861. Brazil, where African Americans were transported for many decades, was able to get rid of slavery later than the previous countries, in 1888. Statistics. For the sake of interest, let's turn to the statistical data on slavery in the United States, especially since these figures may surprise even today. First, for 4 centuries, from the middle of the 16th to the second quarter of the 19th century, about 12 million black people were taken from Africa to several countries of the world. And 50% of the total number of slaves were exported just to the United States. Secondly, until 1865, the total value of all those who lived on the territory of the American continent in monetary terms amounted to more than $3.5 billion. For a moment, that's many times more than the value of all the factories in the northern United States. Fortunately, with the complete abolition of slavery, African Americans were given complete freedom. They were educated and tutored on an equal footing with white people. The former slaves began to feel complete freedom and soon adapted to their new living conditions. Conclusion. Thus, slavery became one of the stages of development of the US economy. During this period, whole businesses were built on the exploitation of black people. But soon, for quite natural reasons, the practice of slavery had to be abandoned once and for all.